We've got a lot to get through. A complete preview of the Democratic National Convention, Night 3. Senator Kamala Harris, the running mate, her big speech tonight. Plus the Fed minutes showing FOMC backing away from September guidance shift. And the post office fight. Get this. That post office fight might lead way to a skinny deal on the stimulus. What gives? I've got complete reaction policy politics from our panel. George C., CEO of Annandale Capital, a Texas businessman and former senior advisor to Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign, and Luis Miranda, former DNC communications director and director of communications and politics at Alloy, which is a nonprofit tech startup for building better data and technology for progressives. Plus, I will check in with Rick Davis, one-on-one with Rick Davis, partner at Stone Core Capital, who, of course, he was the campaign manager for Senator John McCain. But let's kick things off with George C. George C., not George FOMC, George C. I thought it was funny, George. He's the CEO of Annandale Capital. It wasn't funny at all. He's a Texas businessman and former senior advisor to Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. And Luis Miranda, he joins us. He is the former DNC comms director and director of comms now and politics at Alloy, which is a nonprofit tech startup for progressive technology politics. George, Louis, welcome to the show. Louis, I want to start with you. Senator Kamala Harris, she gives her big speech tonight. She will be speaking as will former President Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and Senator Elizabeth Warren. What are you going to be looking for tonight?
I think that this is a coming together kind of evening that really highlights how Democrats are united going forward. And you've seen a little bit of that throughout the week. Tonight certainly and puts an emphasis on it with Warren and Kamala Harris, two of the opponents to Joe Biden during the primaries, two of the powerful ones representing different parts of the party, all teeing up a message of unity. President Obama certainly being someone who maintained neutrality and has been seen as an energizer for the party. So I'm going to be looking for that. I think it's been a really strong week so far. We saw a lot of definition of President Trump in that first evening, particularly with Michelle Obama really framing him as incompetent. You saw last night John Kerry deliver a very powerful message. And I think Kamala tonight has the opportunity to then transition all of this and the unity piece and really talk about the future, and that'll be important.
It's going to be fascinating to see how Senator Harris really does try to, or how she makes her national debut as a running mate. I mean, of course, everyone saw the speech that she did in the rollout, but this is such probably without question the most important speech of her political career thus far. George C., what are you going to be looking for?
Well, first of all, I thought you were funny, and I think it's good to laugh long and loud in these times that are so unusual. I would say
George,
about
George, I got to interrupt. This is why I could talk to you forever, but because you get my weird sense of humor, George. All right, so thank you. I appreciate that. Go ahead.
The weirder and the most eccentric, the better. That's always funny. So I would say about both conventions, not just the Democratic, but the Republican convention, that in this strange year with so many people worried about so many other things in politics and with the virtual nature thereof, it's just a strange time, and viewership's going to be down. And I think voters have their minds on other things. And I think the last month, from like maybe late September into the first week of November, is going to tell the tale. And I think this, I don't know if it's 5% or 15% or 20% of the electorate that's persuadable. They're going to break hard one way or another during that period of time. And I don't know which way they're going to break, but I think both men have a chance to still win this election. But it's going to really depend on how that voter that has bigger issues to deal with right now at this time are going to break when it gets close to the time to pull the lever.
I'm going to rip the script up. I'm ripping the script, as Tom Keene always says. Because George just said something fascinating. I mean, and I've been talking about this for a couple of days now as we're in this virtual medium where you have last night you got two former secretaries of state, one a Democrat, John Kerry, who was the nominee and the standard bearer for the party in 2004, and then, of course, Colin Powell, who's a Bush Republican and is endorsing Joe Biden. If that was in a convention hall, George, those images, plus you got Cindy McCain, you throw her up on the stage as well. Those images, they would have played on the front page, on everything. But what I just heard George C. say, Louis Miranda, is these virtual conventions, the viewership's down. They're going to be a wash. In these viral times, people are trying to figure out if their kids are going to go to school. People are trying to figure out if they're going to have a job to come back to. That it's a wash. It's a wash. I don't know. I could see it going either way, Louis.
Look, I think that the people, because they are concerned about, are their kids going to go to school? Are they going to be able to get back to school safely? I don't think it's just about going to school, but going to school safely. Are their jobs still going to be there? How are they going to manage with so many different pieces? And so they are looking for answers, leadership, and there's wide, broad spread recognition that Donald Trump has just failed to lead in this moment of crisis. So to me, the moment of crisis in many ways puts a bigger emphasis on this. And as far as the format, I think it is challenging, and I think it's been interesting to see how the Democratic National Committee and the campaign and the DNCC have really put together a compelling program in a compressed window that I think is necessary for the change in format. But, conventions have also gotten very bloated and, completely out of scale over the last few years, many years.
You're one of those politicos. Here we go. You don't like the conventions. I totally disagree. I'm all in for the conventions.
I love the conventions, but I do think that there was going to be a necessary shift in conventions anyway, and this in some ways forces the parties to experiment with that in a way that I think will be positive for future conventions.
You know what, George? Lewis doesn't even know what he could be doing this week. He could be out in Milwaukee eating cheese curds if they had the convention. Okay, he doesn't even know it, George. George, let me ask you, what do you think Republicans are watching and learning, and maybe might tweak in terms of the medium for next week?
Well, I think they're going to have to paint a contrast, and I do think the Democrats are doing a nice job of trying to appear centric and trying to highlight the Republicans that loathe Trump so much they want to be for Biden. So I think they're doing a pretty good job of that. But my problem with both conventions is it's basically just rallying the base at this point. I love conventions. I think they're beautiful pep rallies and they're great American pageantry. And if I were the Trump team, I would have it be just wrapped in the flag and very patriotic and very pro-America, pro-business, pro-family, pro-law enforcement, things of that sort. But pro-Black Lives Matter, too, not with big B, big L, big M, but Black Lives Matter in all African Americans of every shape, short, and size, regardless of political affiliation, and just be super patriotic. But I would turn again that I think this election is going to break in the last 30 days, and it's unpredictable which way it's going to go. And one more comment about the
hold that comment because it's going to it's what we call the tease for the future. But we'll come back with more from George C. and Louis Miranda, and we're going to of course talk the Fed and foreign policy. My name is Kevin Cirilli. Panel stays. I'm the chief Washington correspondent for Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. You're listening to Bloomberg 99.1.
This is Bloomberg Sound On with Kevin Cirilli on Bloomberg 99.1 and 105.7 FM HD2.
My name is Kevin Cirilli. I am the chief Washington correspondent for Bloomberg Television and Bloomberg Radio. Matt Shirley and Christine Barada in the chat in the break, just keeping my energy up. Remember, folks, you can watch all of our continuing special coverage of not only the Democratic National Convention, but also next week's Republican National Convention on Bloomberg Television. David Weston's been leading an all-star conversation, and we're going to check in with one of those all-stars who's been a part of that, Rick Davis. He was the campaign manager to now the late Senator John McCain, so we're going to talk to him coming up in this hour. And I'll be there, too. I'll be at the White House all night, all tomorrow night, and of course all throughout next week. Louis Miranda's with us. Louis is former DNC comms director and now at Alloy, where he is the director of comms and politics. And George C., CEO of Annandale Capital, a Texas businessman, and of course the former senior advisor to Marco Rubio's 2016 presidential campaign. George, I had to cut you off earlier, so I wanted you to make your last point. What was it?
Yeah, my last point was basically that Trump has has definitely made his fair share of mistakes along the way. There's no doubt about that. But I think most Americans, and I mean a super majority of Americans, realize just how difficult dealing with this was and how unprepared the last 3 or 4 administrations have been for this and in preparation. And you look at the governors of California and New York and Texas and Florida, and they've been fumbling around in the dark looking for the light switch too. So and then you look at former Vice President Biden, and he has literally been in his basement for months. And I don't think that expresses great leadership either. So I think it's kind of a scratch on all this, and how Trump presents himself and the policies he will use, and the way that Biden presents himself and the policies he will try to put in place is going to be the defining factor in the last 30 days.
I think if you want to, hinge this election on specific policies, I don't think that that's what's going to be defining it. And even if it was, I think Biden would carry the advantage. I think traditionally Democrats are the ones who focus a lot on policy. And I think that right now, it's the American people are feeling very personally the impacts of Trump's failed leadership. And look, I don't know who you're talking to, but 58% of Americans in the latest survey said they don't approve of the way Trump has responded to the outbreak. And that's
but then you look at those same polls, Louis, and I hear you. You look at those same polls, and he's still leading on the economy, which I find fascinating, even in the midst of this economic depression. Let me ask you this, Louis. There's been a lot of talk about Joe Biden making a centrist pitch during this convention, and you see that play out, whether it's AOC only getting 90 seconds to speak in a video, or even Bernie Sanders' speech was, in many ways, it talked a little bit about policy, but it was more about just defeating Trump. But let me ask you this. Does Joe Biden and the campaign, do they risk alienating the base? I mean, because to George's point, I think for many people, their minds are made up, and it's a turnout election.
I think that, Biden, his campaign has done a really good job of bringing in progressives, and, Bernie stuck it out in part. One of the reasons that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was there to nominate him last night is because he didn't drop out, because he wanted to have an impact on the platform, and he did. This is the most progressive platform for the Democrats have run on. And so you can do that. I think that one of the things that's great about Joe Biden is that you can get away from this false alternative that people try to set up in politics, where you either go to one extreme or the other. And what he's capable of showing is that you can be someone who governs with maturity, with the best interest of the American people, be extremely progressive, but also be overall just good for the country in a way that unites us. And I think that's a lot of what today is about. You have people on stage tonight, from students from Marjorie Stoneman Douglas to plenty of examples of real people who are suffering in Trump's, you're talking about polls, 51% of respondents say they're very angry about the current state of the country. That's not insignificant. And so I think that the Biden camp has done a good job of bringing that together and being able to show a much bigger tent and a broader tent that I think portends problems for Donald Trump.
We're going to come back to politics coming up, and of course the U.S. Postal Service, but I do want to hit the economy with George because there was the Fed minutes came out today. And George, did you see the Fed minutes?
I have not yet.
Well, I want to get your take, because the U.S. central bankers, they backed off from an earlier readiness to clarify their guidance on the future path of interest rates when they met in July. And this according to a record of the gathering that was released Wednesday, the Fed minutes. Quote, this according to the minutes, quote, with regard to the outlook for monetary policy beyond this meeting, a number of participants noted that providing greater clarity regarding the likely path of the target range for the federal funds rate would be appropriate at some point. This according to the July 28th, 29th meeting. That's a subtle change from the previous set of minutes, which indicating policymakers were keen to sharpen their so-called forward guidance, quote, at upcoming meetings, end quote. And so the next gathering is in mid-September, September 15th and 16th. I think this is really fascinating because it's greater clarity on the rate path seen appropriate at some point, but that the coronavirus pandemic is going to weigh heavily on the economy in the near term. So they're shifting away from their earlier readiness to clarify guidance on the future path of interest rates, i.e. stall. I mean, how do you interpret that, George C.?
Well, I would intro by respectfully completely disagreeing with Lewis. I think the country thinks everybody's done a pretty poor job on pandemic, and I think it's a scratch. And I think that key group of voters in the last 30 days is going to be looking at what's the lesser of two evils here. I think the country is completely divided, and I think uniting the country is a stretch in the next 3 months. It's going to take years to do that. And on the economy, I think they're going to look at the economic issues and say, do I want a laissez-faire, pro-business, less regulation government, or do I want a high-regulation, high-tax government? And you're seeing signs, and that's what the Fed's noting there too, Kevin, is that you're seeing rumblings of inflation in the price of gold and in commodities coming back and things of that sort. We may be facing under a very pro-big government, high-tax, high-regulation government with much slower economic growth, a return to the 70s of stagflation where commodities and other prices soar while the economy is stagnant. That's a miserable. Remember Carter and the misery index. So if you compare that to no matter what thinks about Trump, good or bad, a pro-business government, I think people are going to look at that from an economic issue standpoint going forward. And I think that Republicans pay every bit as much attention and independence to issues as Democrats do.